Hello everyone, welcome back to Arpita ki NCERT Kaksha. Today we are starting with chapter number 6, the crisis of democratic order. Now what is this chapter all about? ये chapter बात किस बारे में कर रहा है? Basically this chapter is going to understand what kind of crisis or issues came up after 1967 which also shook the basics the roots of the democratic order in India. India में democracy established हुआ, ठीक है, after we got independent we established democracy in India. We followed democracy even after Jawaharlal Nehru's death. You know, at that time we had studied in chapter number 4 and chapter 5 that Jawaharlal Nehruji's death shook the entire nation. We were, looking at our next leader who will, restore the democracy in the nation, who will carry out the lineage of, Nehruji, his ideologies, etc. Who is going to bind the entire nation together just like Nehruji did, and who will bring forward the mature form of democracy in India. And all of this resulted into a lot of crisis. Indira Gandhi ji ka election hua tha and there were so many political crises because of which the roots of democracy were shaking. So in this lecture we will study the different kind of issues and crises in the democratic order of our nation. So there were different changes that were taking place in Indian politics after 1967. Indira Gandhi ji had emerged as a towering leader with tremendous popularity. This period witnessed tensions in the relationship of opposition parties and the main government, tension between relationship between government and judiciary. We have studied the Keshavananda Bharati case also. There is a separate lecture that I had made, individual lecture on Keshavananda Bharati case. So I'll give you the link of that lecture in this PDF. You can click on it and watch that lecture as well. There were many initiatives by Indira Gandhi government, for example, the emergency of 1975, the Keshavananda Bharati case. So Supreme Court basically found many initiatives of the government as violative of the constitution. But Congress party was adamant and very arrogant on its stand. Congress party instead tried to criticize the Supreme Court itself. Congress took the position that the stand of the Supreme Court is against the principles of democracy and parliamentary supremacy. Congress party was becoming more and more arrogant and adamant at that time, and that is why we saw the rise of so many strikes, Naxal movement, the emergency period, the rise of so many opposition parties, so many opposition leaders. For example, Jai Prakash Narayan ji, we will study about him as well. So, and plus there were splits in the Congress that were going on. There were divisions in the Congress party itself that was going on. So that period since 1967 witnessed huge amount of crisis in the entire nation. Let us look at the economic condition of India after the elections of 1971. We know that in 1971 there was East Pakistan war also. Bangladesh got divided from Pakistan. India supported Bangladesh. We had studied in the previous lecture that India signed a friendship treaty with USSR. USSR promised us that it is going to protect us no matter what in this Bangladesh and Pakistan fight, because US and China were supporting Pakistan at that time. So that is why USSR came forward. It promised us by signing a treaty that it's going to protect us if there is any attack which happens on India. So in the election of 1971, Congress had given the slogan of Garibi Hatao. Garibi Hatao means remove poverty. Hatao means remove, Garibi means poverty. But the social and economic condition at that time in our nation did not, basically improve even after giving this slogan. स्लोगन एक बात होती है और एक्चुअल जो फील्ड का काम होता है, प्रैक्टिकल लाइफ लाइफ होती है या सिचुएशन होती है, वो डिफरेंट होती है. बाय गिविंग स्लोगन्स यू कैन नॉट इम्प्रूव द सिचुएशन, यू हैव टू वर्क टुवर्ड्स इट. बट एट दैट टाइम करप्शन वाज रैम्पेंट, inflation was there, prices were rising, food grains में shortage हो रही थी. So by giving slogans you cannot improve the condition of any nation, and that was witnessed after the elections of 1971. After Bangladesh crisis, US government stopped any kind of help to India because US was supporting Pakistan at that time. तो US ने बोल दिया कि भाई इंडिया को हम किसी तरीके का उस वक्त सपोर्ट नहीं प्रोवाइड करेंगे. Prices increased by 23% in 1973 and 30% in 1974, because of which there were so many protests that were taken by even the students in India. कितने प्रोटेस्ट स्टूडेंट्स के द्वारा भी भारत में लिए गए थे? क्यों? क्योंकि प्राइसेस बेनागा बढ़ते चले जा रहे थे, फूड ग्रेन्स की शॉर्टेज हो रही थी, अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट वाज राइजिंग, Industrial growth was very low. Especially the rural areas were getting impacted a lot, क्योंकि food grains की shortage ना rural areas में ज़्यादा देखने को मिल रही थी. Monsoons failed, so agriculture sector was also going down. Productivity was failing, and still the Congress was giving this slogan, "Garibi hatao." How can we use this slogan in improving the nation when on field you are not doing anything? जब आप field में practically काम कुछ नहीं कर रहे हो, slogan देने से क्या हो जाएगा? So at that time we also witnessed that only slogans never work. स्लोगन सिर्फ काम नहीं करते हैं. You have to actually do something if you want to improve the condition of the nation. And there were increase in activities of the Marxist groups. They were, basically because of agriculture failure, because of poverty, unemployment, the unemployed youth, they were taking up struggles and protests against the government. And at that time we saw the rise of Naxalites. उसी वक्त हमने देखा नैक्सलिज्म में इंक्रीज. जो अनएम्प्लॉयड यूथ थी वो इतने उत्तेजित होकर बैठी थी, इतना गुस्सा होकर बैठी थी गवर्नमेंट से कि उन्होंने आर्म्स एंड एम्युनिशंस उठा लिए. दे थॉट दैट ओनली थ्रू इंसर्जेंट टेक्निक्स वी कैन ओवरथ्रो दिस पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम, दिस गवर्नमेंट which is not looking for the benefits of the rural people, the people like us. And this group was known as the Marxist Leninist group. Now it is known as the Maoist or Naxalites. ये जो आपके जो ग्रुप्स है ना, मार्क्सिस्ट और लेनिनिस्ट ग्रुप, जिनको आप नैक्सलाइट्स बोलते हैं, ये वेस्ट बंगाल में और नॉर्थ ईस्टर्न स्टेट्स में बहुत पावरफुल है, बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग है. देन देयर वर टू वेरी प्रोमिनेंट मूवमेंट्स एट दैट टाइम व्हिच टुक प्लेस, द गुजरात एंड द बिहार मूवमेंट. जैन 1974 में गुजरात के स्टूडेंट्स ने प्रोटेस्ट करना शुरू कर दिया. व्हाई दे वर प्रोटेस्टिंग? दे वर प्रोटेस्टिंग बिकॉज ऑफ द राइज इन प्राइसेस, because of the corruption in high places. ऐसा नहीं था कि only prices were only rising. That was not the case. There were corruption also that was rising. That means India was suffering. But these top class government officials, the ministers, I am hinting towards the ministers, they were enjoying their life lavishly because of corruption. यहाँ पर citizens, जनता भूखी मर रही है, वहाँ ministers corruption में enjoy कर रहे हैं, अपनी lavish lifestyle जी रहे हैं. And that is why there were huge scale protests against the Indira Gandhi government at that time, which were held in Gujarat in 1975. And Congress elections were conducted and Congress was defeated in these elections. So that was natural, ये तो होना ही था. जब आप सिर्फ स्लोगन्स दे रहे हो, काम कुछ कर नहीं रहे हो, प्राइस राइज हो रहा है, पीपल आर एजिटेटेड, पीपल आर कंफ्यूज, दे आर basically they are angry because of your administration, they will not vote for you. So the Congress party was defeated. And in March 1974, same year, March के month में, there was protest in Bihar also. And at that time, the leader of the protest was Jai Prakash Narayan. He was invited by the students to lead the students movement against the government. Now, do you know that Jai Prakash Narayan, he was born in 1902. 11 अक्टूबर को ना इनका बर्थ सेलिब्रेशन किया जाता है. He was born on 11th October 1902. And he was born in Bihar. He was influenced by Marxist ideas in the USA and the Gandhian ideology. In 1929, he joined the Indian National Congress. He was imprisoned because of the participation in the civil disobedience movement in 1932. In 1934, he played a very important role in the formation of Congress Socialist Party, which was a left-wing group within the Congress Party. Post-independence also he played a very major role because in 1948 he left the Congress Party. 1948 में इन्होंने कांग्रेस पार्टी को छोड़ दिया था. He initiated an anti-Congress campaign. This is not in the PDF of the lecture. Please note it down or take a screenshot of this. In 1952 he formed the Praja Socialist Party. These are important facts for prelims. In 1954 he devoted his life to Bhudan Yagna movement, which was the movement started by Vinoba Bhave, which demanded land redistribution to the landless people. And also it is said that he created an total revolution against Indira Gandhi regime because she was found guilty of violating the electoral laws by the Allahabad High Court. So he advocated a program of social transformation, which he also termed as, please write it down, Sampurna Kranti, which was social transformation, total revolution. Sampurna Kranti का मतलब क्या होता है? Total revolution. He launched this program against the Indira Gandhi government. Okay, total revolution basically had different components of revolutions. There were political revolutions, social revolutions, economic, cultural, ideological, intellectual, educational, spiritual revolutions that he undertook. against the Indira Gandhi government, and the objective was one. The objective was to bring a change in the existing society, to bring a change that is in tune with the ideals of Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya is a Gandhian philosophy which means progress for everybody, progress for all. And he was also posthumously, after he died, he was given India's highest civilian award called Bharat Ratna. इनको भारत रत्न भी दिया गया जो सबसे highest civilian award माना जाता है, and this was given to him after he died. It was given to him in 1999 for his contribution to the freedom struggle and upliftment of the poor and downtrodden people. So please take a screenshot of this particular page because it's going to help you in your prelims examination. Now we came across a term called Naxalism. Basically, Naxalism is a form of Maoism also only, right? It has come from the Maoist movement only. Why Naxalism? Because it originated in India in the village of West Bengal called Naxalbari. That is why it is known as Naxalism. Now, what is Maoism? Maoism is a form of communism only, which was developed by Mao Zedong. That you have to remember. It's a kind of principle or doctrine, or you can say philosophy, to capture state power, to overthrow the government and capture the power through mass mobilization, alliances, insurgency, protest, etc. तो एक तरीके का ये political term है, एक form of communism ही है, जिसके अंदर क्या किया जाता है, गवर्नमेंट जो बैठी है ना उसको हटाने के लिए strategic alliances, गठबंधन बनाए जाते हैं, mobilization किया जाता है, and then insurgency की जाती है, protest किया जाता है. So that is the meaning of Maoism. So Jayaprakash Narayan ji, he started a total Sampurna revolution, Sampurna Kranti, that we have already studied. In 1975, he led a people's march to the parliament. He was protesting against the government. He was trying to overthrow the government. So he carried out people's march to the parliament. He was supported by the people who were against the Congress party or the opposition parties like Bharatiya Jan Sangh, the Bharatiya Lok Dal party, etc. They were supporting Jayaprakash Narayan ji. And on the other hand, this was going on. People were protesting against the government. And on the other hand, there were Naxalite movements which were rising up. In 1969, Charu Majumdar, he formed the Communist Party that was basically following the ideas of Naxalism. माओइज्म के आइडियाज जो है, मार्क्सिस्ट आइडियाज जो हैं, उनको फॉलो करते थे चारू मजूमदार जी. उन्होंने ये कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी स्टार्ट करी एंड दे स्टार्टेड मार्चिंग टू रिमूव द गवर्नमेंट फ्रॉम द पावर, टू कैप्चर द स्टेट पावर. दे स्टार्टेड क्रिएटिंग इंसर्जेंसीज एंड टिल नाउ द नक्सलाइट मूवमेंट दिस हैज नाउ स्प्लिंटर्ड इनटू वेरियस पार्टीज. पहले तो एक ही पार्टी थी, अब देयर आर डिफरेंट पार्टीज. इट इज सेड दैट अराउंड 75 parties are there which basically have Marxist ideas, and there are 9 states in the northeastern area of India where the Naxalite movement is at its peak right now. Then in 1974 we saw a large scale 20 days railway strike that was led by George Fernandes at that time. Now, who was George Fernandes? He was the former defense minister and anti-emergency crusader. He was also a trade unionist, he was a journalist, agriculturist, and he, as the president of All India Railways Federation, he led the railway strike in 1974, which resulted in thousands of people being sent to jail. It was one of the events that led to the imposition of emergency in 1975. ये जो railway strike हुआ था 1974 का, it was a trigger movement or trigger moment when the emergency was imposed, or you can say why the emergency was imposed. He also became later on the industry minister in the Janata Party government under the prime ministership of Morarji Desai in 1977. And after the split in the Janata Dal in 1994, Fernandes formed the Samata Party. He also formed, write it down, this is important for prelims, the Samata Party, along with the present, Bihar Chief Minister Nitish Kumar. The party became an ally of BJP in 1996, and under the prime ministership of Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji, he was the defense minister of India during the Kargil war in 1999. He was also elected to the Lok Sabha 9 times. So since very young, he has been involved in various different movements in India. Then, when you talk about the Indira Gandhi government and the Congress government in the 90s, we also see that there was huge conflict of Congress party with judiciary, which was seen in the Keshavananda Bharati case. I have created a special lecture on Keshavananda Bharati case. Please go through this lecture today itself. आज इस lecture को मैंने PDF में link दिया है. I will also give the link on the Telegram group. Go through this lecture, and only then you will understand what kind of conflicts were there between the government and the judiciary. So when we talk about the emergency period 1975 का जब हम emergency period की बात करते हैं, this is a really important topic in this chapter. 12th June 1975, the Allahabad High Court passed a judgment which declared Indira Gandhi's election to Lok Sabha as invalid. Now, there was a petition which was filed in Allahabad High Court. The petition was filed by Raj Narain, who was a opposition, party leader against Indira Gandhi government, and against Indira Gandhi, he also stood in the elections in 1971. So he filed a petition. The petition was, heard in the Allahabad High Court, and Allahabad High Court declared that Indira Gandhi's election to Lok Sabha was invalid. And that is why there was a nationwide emergency which was declared. On the other hand, Jay Prakash Narayan ji also announced a nationwide satyagraha against Indira Gandhi's government, and he demanded her resignation. He also asked the army, the police, the government employees to not obey or not follow any immoral or illegal orders of Indira Gandhi government. And that is why government invoked Article 352 of the Constitution on June 25th, 1975 on the grounds of इंटरनल डिस्टर्बेंस. किस ग्राउंड पर ये आर्टिकल यूज किया गया? इंटरनल डिस्टर्बेंस के ग्राउंड पर ये आर्टिकल यूज किया गया. इट वॉज इन प्लेस फॉर 21 months, यानी कि इमरजेंसी 21 महीने तक लागू रही. इट वॉज विड्रॉन ऑन 21st March 1977. Basically, the Article 352 was used to declare national emergency by Indira Gandhi government. And because of this declaration, there were different reasons why this declaration was made by Indira Gandhi government. The government said that there is a huge threat to national security. There are bad economic conditions going on. Unnecessary protests are going on. That is why we are using Article 352. The order gave central government the authority to rule by decree. To rule by decree. That means whatever orders they were passing, they had to be followed. The civil liberties were curbed, were restricted. The fundamental rights were restricted. An external emergency was already in place at the time of the proclamation of national emergency, and it had a very serious impact on India's democratic nature. There was also one very important amendment which was enacted in 1976 during emergency. This was the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, which was enacted during the period of internal emergency, which strengthened the union executive. It led to further centralization of power of the Indira Gandhi government. Basically, the government had 4 purposes to serve by enacting this Amendment Act. First was to exclude the courts entirely from any kind of election disputes, because here we studied that Allahabad court had passed a judgment which declared Indira Gandhi's election to Lok Sabha as invalid. So in order to remove the courts, exclude the courts from any kind of election dispute and to safeguard their position, the government passed this Constitutional Amendment Act. Second reason was to strengthen central government, to give maximum protection from judicial challenges to social revolutionary legislation, and to stop intervention of judiciary in the legislative matters. The amendments could not be questioned in any court on any ground. There shall be no limitation on Parliament's power to amend the Constitution by way of addition, variation or repeal. Basically, they were trying to establish totalitarianism. They were trying to shake the democratic order of the country. That is why when we see the Keshavananda Bharati case judgment, we are relieved, we are happy that the court did not allow the government to become supreme. The government, basically was not allowed by Supreme Court in this Keshavananda Bharati case judgment to become more powerful than the Constitution. So during this emergency period, the federal powers or the federal distribution of power was suspended, Agitation was abruptly stopped, strikes were banned, opposition leaders were put in jail. Political situation became very quiet because all the opposition leaders who were standing against the government, they were put up in jail, or some of those leaders went underground. Government suspended the freedom of press. Freedom of press is the most important freedom which is present in a democratic nation, and that was suspended. The Rashtriya Swayamsevak Samaj was also banned. Jamaat-e-Islami was banned. Fundamental rights were suspended. And government made extensive use of preventive detention. What is preventive detention? Preventive detention एक ऐसी सिचुएशन होती है जब अगर गवर्नमेंट को आपके ऊपर शक है कि आप किसी तरीके की लॉ एंड ऑर्डर की सिचुएशन को खराब कर सकते हो, तो आपको गवर्नमेंट घर में कैद कर देगी. आप घर में अपने कैद होकर रह जाएंगे, बाहर पुलिस फोर्सेस को लगा दिया जाएगा. उसको हम प्रिवेंटिव डिटेंशन बोलते हैं. Government also arrested political workers and they were not allowed to challenge their own arrest in the High Court or in the Supreme Court. Journalists were arrested because they were writing against emergency. There was a huge chaos which India witnessed at that time. Extraordinary restrictions were placed on civil liberties, especially the freedom of speech and expression. General elections, the very basis of democratic setup in the country, were suspended. जनरल इलेक्शंस तो एक डेमोक्रेटिक नेशन की पहचान होते हैं, उनको भी सस्पेंड कर दिया गया. All newspapers needed to get prior approval for all their materials to be published. So there was press censorship. This is also against democracy. ये भी democracy के against जाता है, press censorship. Point समझ आ रहा है? So what were the lessons that we learned after emergency? We learned that, see, emergency was applied, then it was removed also. Congress basically lost the election. People did not now trust Congress party. ना ही कांग्रेस लीडर्स पे कोई ट्रस्ट कर रहा था, ना कांग्रेस पार्टी पर. लोगों ने पूरी तरीके से कांग्रेस पे अपना भरोसा हटा दिया था. So basically we won back our democracy after this emergency period. So we learned that it is extremely difficult to remove democracy in India. People will not bear these kind of situations again in India. हम अगर डेमोक्रेसी को आप हटाने की कोशिश करोगे तो लोग खड़े हो जाएंगे आपके अगेंस्ट. यू विल फेस द wrath of people if you try to remove democracy from India. Second lesson that we learned, that if you are trying to put in emergency in a particular nation, you have to give it in writing. Orally आप फोन करके emergency नहीं लगा सकते एक रातों ही रात में. आपको writing में देना पड़ेगा. You have to follow full procedure. If all the council of ministers, this kind of order can be passed. Or third lesson that we learned was that it made everyone more aware of the value of civil services. From that time administration became more and more stricter. उस time से ही administration और ज़्यादा strict होना शुरू हो गया. That the government abruptly cannot rule as it wishes. It has to take into account the administration, proper procedure, proper structure, the very basis of democracy. It has to respect the executive, it has to respect the judiciary, it has to respect the desires and needs of the citizens who have elected you to become the prime minister or the cabinet ministers. Now after this emergency was removed, the post-emergency constitutional safeguards came into the forefront. Prominent changes were introduced to place safeguards against the misuse of emergency provisions through enacting the Constitutional Amendment Act 44th. The 44th Constitutional Amendment Act was enacted in order to protect the nation against any kind of misuse through emergency. Article 74 subsection 1 was introduced, in which it was said that President can ask the Council of Ministers to reconsider their advice given to him. अगर काउंसिल ऑफ मिनिस्टर कोई भी एडवाइस प्रेसिडेंट को देते हैं तो प्रेसिडेंट को अगर वो एडवाइस पसंद नहीं है तो वो काउंसिल ऑफ मिनिस्टर को बोल सकता है कि अपनी एडवाइस को फिर से रिकंसिडर करो. But the president has to act in accordance with the advice given after reconsideration. Article 226 was introduced. It was amended to restore the power of High Court to issue writs of matters other than the protection of fundamental rights. Fundamental rights के अलावा अगर कोई किसी इशू पे writs issue करने हैं किसी भी मैटर पे तो हाई कोर्ट वो कर सकता है. Article 352 was amended to provide that the proclamation of emergency can be issued only when security of India or any part of its territory is threatened by war or external aggression or armed rebellion. आर्टिकल 352 को अमेंड किया गया कि अपने इच्छा से अपने खिलाफ विरोध हो रहा है गवर्नमेंट के खिलाफ, तो इसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि इमरजेंसी लगा दिया। इमरजेंसी तभी लगेगी जब या तो भारत की सिक्योरिटी या भारत के किसी पार्ट या किसी स्टेट की सिक्योरिटी या किसी टेरिटरी की सिक्योरिटी थ्रेटेंड है, या तो वॉर की वजह से, या बाहर से कोई एग्रेशन हो रहा है, एक्सटर्नल एग्रेशन हो रहा है, या कोई आर्म्ड रेबिलियन हो रहा है। इंटरनल डिस्टर्बेंस कैन नॉट अमाउंट टू आर्म्ड रेबिलियन, ओके, ओनली आर्म्ड रेबिलियन, नो। इंटरनल डिस्टर्बेंस मतलब ये नहीं कि सिर्फ आर्म्ड रेबिलियन ही है, it can be armed rebellion or war or external aggression, but people are protesting against the government is not the reason to impose emergency. लोग गवर्नमेंट के खिलाफ प्रोटेस्ट कर रहे हैं, इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि इमरजेंसी लगा दी जाए, नो, यू कैन नॉट डू दैट. It became mandatory for the president to issue a proclamation of emergency only after it has been communicated to him in writing. लिखित में दो कि इमरजेंसी लगानी है तुम्हें रीजंस के साथ, तभी प्रेसिडेंट उसको रिकंसिडर करेगा, समझेगा. अगर उसको नहीं समझ आता है तो इस नोटिस को वापस भी भेज सकता है प्रेसिडेंट. इट हैज टू बी अप्रूव्ड विद इन अ पीरियड ऑफ 1 month. पहले 2 महीने का टाइम था, अब 1 month का टाइम इसमें कर दिया गया कि 1 महीने के अंदर अप्रूव करो आप. ठीक है, बताओ कि अप्रूव करना है या नहीं करना है. एंड फॉर द कॉन्टिन्यूएंस ऑफ इमरजेंसी, अप्रूवल बाय रेजोल्यूशन ऑफ बोथ हाउसेज ऑफ पार्लियामेंट, लोकसभा एंड राज्यसभा, विल बी रिक्वायर्ड एवरी 6 month. अगर आपको इमरजेंसी को कंटिन्यू करना है, लग गई एक बार इमरजेंसी, इसे कंटिन्यू करना है, तो लोकसभा और राज्यसभा दोनों की परमिशन चाहिए होगी हर 6 महीने बाद. पॉइंट क्लियर हो रहा है? Proclamation of emergency will be cancelled whenever the Lok Sabha passes a resolution by simple majority. That you have to remember. Okay. So after the elections, general elections which were conducted after this emergency was over, it's but obvious that Congress lost the election. Congress इसमें हार गया था. So this was the entire situation in the nation when it comes to the period after 1967. तो आज का होमवर्क क्वेश्चन देख लेते हैं. Discuss the significance of Supreme Court's verdict in Keshavananda Bharti case judgment. I have given you the link of this lecture. Keshavananda Bharti case का मैंने आपको lecture का link दिया है. So you can watch that lecture and then you'll answer this question कि what is the importance of the Supreme Court's verdict. जो Supreme Court ने verdict pass किया ना, whatever judgment Supreme Court passed, what's the importance behind that? What's the significance behind that? Basically Supreme Court proved that Constitution से ऊपर कोई नहीं हो सकता. Supreme Court proved it that nobody can sit or stand above the Constitution through this verdict. Second question, explain how national emergency of 1975 affected India as a democracy. Also discuss the constitutional safeguards that we have discussed right now. यहाँ पर हमने discuss किया ना constitutional safeguards सारे, and how it impacted India as a democracy. These were the impacts on India's democratic order or democratic nature. ये हमने यहाँ पर सारे impact पढ़े हैं. Okay, so again question number 1 and question number 2 आपको answer करना है. So this was all for today's chapter. 30 minutes के अंदर हमने पूरा chapter अच्छे से cover कर लिया. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Do let me know if you have any doubts. Okay.